Thank you for joining Wars of the Roses. As we continue with Part 10, Ancient Phoenicia of a Long Civilization's Trail, an account of recent experiences in mystic places and strange lands by Ralph M. Lewis, KRC. An article taken from Rosicrucian Digest, Volume 15, Number 12, January 1938. A Long Civilization's Trail by Ralph M. Lewis, KRC. Editor's note: this is the 10th episode of a narrative by the Supreme Secretary relating the experiences he and his party had in visiting mystic shrines and places in Europe and the ancient world. Ancient Phoenicia. Racing through bowers of fragrant shrubs and then suddenly sweeping upward to skim along the crest of rocky slopes overlooking the broad expanse of the Mediterranean, our spirits rose with each turn in the road. Not more than 2 hours previously we had been in Palestine, but its blue skies had been colored by our feelings. A pall of dejection had hung over us because of our intimate experiences with its bitter revolution. How can one doubt that we mortals are torn by the strong influences of environment and our mental attitudes? The most dominant factor in life is our attitude toward things and people, our personal interpretations. If we are confident, cheerful, and courageous, every obstacle is but another stride to be taken in our progress. The most sordid environment, even the darkest hour, becomes but a background by which to contrast our radiant spirits. Let hope and self-assurance ebb, however, and the slightest change in circumstances becomes to us a wave of calamity by which we are completely engulfed. This but proves that the world is impartial. It never intentionally oppresses the individual, nor does it favor him. Time either sweeps the individual along with it or passes him by. The mentally alert, visionary individual is prepared to strike out and swim with the current. He is never content to bewail his lot on the bank, watching life flow by. The Mediterranean was exceptionally blue, rather of the colored postcard hue, almost unbelievably brilliant. The sunlight seemed to dance upon its glass-like surface. This coastline of ancient Phoenicia, now Syria, was amazingly like that of California. The mountains seemed to plunge into the sea. No gradual approach, but an abrupt demarcation, a bold precipice submerging itself in the waters. It was as if the parched desert far inland had by a series of undulations sought to reach the sea, and suddenly coming upon it, one of its crests had slipped beneath the water. The surrounding terrain was little changed. Nowhere for miles along this coast were evidences of human progress, except for the pavement upon which we traveled. The coastal hills were uncultivated, although spotted with verdure, but unlike our California coast range, they were unfenced. Beautiful sandy beaches marked the erosion of the rocky shore by the sea, beaches which in a more commercialized land would have been marred by gaudy concessions. Little harbor bays were formed by jutting rugged arms of the coast. In these still waters, about 1000 BC, floated the sturdy but small craft of the Phoenicians. At that time, black-bearded men who but a few centuries previous had been desert wanderers, nomads, directed the loading of the boats. They carried cargoes of mother-of-pearl inlay furniture, ivory combs, household utensils, gold trinkets, frankincense, and other luxuries with which to barter with the peoples of distant countries bordering the shores of the Mediterranean. They were at that time the greatest navigators of the world. They ventured as far west as what is now Spain, and carried on an extensive trade with the early Greeks, who were greatly influenced by the Phoenician dress and customs. It is said that the early Greeks borrowed their style of costume from the Phoenicians. As they prospered in their trade, they colonized many towns along the coast of the eastern end of the Mediterranean. Cars were now passing us rather frequently, going in the opposite direction. We were approaching Beirut, the principal seaport of Syria, or the state of Lebanon. In a few moments, we were slowly moving through the streets of this city, which was quite evidently influenced by Western ideas and practices. The change in the appearance of shop windows from those of Egypt and Palestine, the large paved thoroughfares, elaborate cafes, spacious lawns, even public trams, did not give us the impression of the Western world attempting to invade the East, but rather that it had already arrived and the East was trying to survive the influence. Originally captured by the British in October 1908, The country is now a French-mandated territory, but the city of Beirut is exceptionally Americanized because of the great American university now established there, whose faculty members are mainly from the United States. These instructors brought with them their manner and methods of living, and with their families gradually impressed the natives with their superior way of living, to which the natives have taken readily. Our stay in Beirut was brief, for it was not our immediate destination. We were bound for the inland. Leaving the sea level, we began a very steep ascent, winding our way over the high mountains. Lebanon, as this section is known, is renowned for being the site of the once famous cedar trees, by the same name, for centuries used extensively in the building operations of the ancient peoples whose countries bordered the Mediterranean. But one small grove of the great trees still remains, and it is preserved as a monument of the past. Centuries before Christ, the Egyptians put out expeditions to this coast to fell the great trees and float them back to the mouth of the Nile, thence up the great river for hundreds of miles. The writer recently had the opportunity of examining thoroughly several sarcophagi, mummy coffins, being installed in the new editions of the Rosicrucian Oriental and Egyptian Museum. These sarcophagi date back to approximately 1000 BC. Each of them was made, as practically all of them were during that time, from planks of cedar brought from Lebanon centuries ago. Even though they were about 30 centuries old, they were yet in a fair state of preservation. Many of the early fleets that plied the waters of the Mediterranean were built of the cedars of Lebanon. It was a rare wood and much sought after. Toward the south end of the Lebanon mountains towers Mount Hermon, reaching a height of 9,000 feet. The mountain is frequently mentioned in the Christian Bible by other names. Around its base are to be found the ruins of the temples of Baal. Generally speaking, Baal is an ancient sun god, but genetically speaking, Baal was the Syro-Phoenician word meaning God. The ancient Sidonians had named this mountain Syrian. It is without vegetation of any kind except a plant life resembling our North American sagebrush. To this point in our travels, our roads had been remarkably well paved and graded. Now they narrowed and were frequently pitted. The hills were growing brown as though they needed rain badly. The country was becoming more desolate and had its effect upon our moods, and our conversation became less frequent. About 2 hours after having left Beirut and having just made a turn on a high mountain pass, we looked down from an altitude of several thousand feet upon a broad plateau stretching into the distance. Far below, our road continued, like a grey ribbon stretching for miles across the waste. Toward the horizon, a great green patch was visible. Soon we were entering this patch, the outer edge of a fertile area, and the age-old city of Damascus, which is on the fringe of the great Mesopotamian desert. Damascus, 57 miles east of Beirut, has a population of about 188,000, 21,000 of which are Christians and about 16,000 Jews. It is the oldest inhabited city in the world. In the Tel El Amarna tablets or letters, the first letters of state in the history of the world exchanged between Queen Nefertiti and the rulers of her subordinate states or colonies in 1350 BC, Damascus is mentioned. At that early time, according to translations, it was termed Dimashqa, the same name referring to the same city as found inscribed on the walls of the Temple of Ramesses III in Upper Egypt. It was the scene of many wars mentioned in biblical literature. David had campaigned against it, but without a great deal of success. French troops were garrisoned there as elsewhere in Syria, but were unsuccessful in accomplishing much with Damascus, or any of Syria in fact, because of an antipathy held toward them by the native Syrians. Various political influences, which we will describe later, caused the French much unrest and a regret that they had ever assumed the mandate. Our first impressive sight after entering this ancient city was a large cemetery near the city's center, the tombs of which were fashioned like small mosques with their customary domed roofs and spiral minarets. They were so diminutive that I likened them to the ovens one sees used for the manufacturing of tile and brick. Around the whole cemetery was an artistic Byzantine brick wall, the top of which was crenellated. When our car stopped before the principal hostelry which the city afforded, located in a plaza directly across from the depot of a narrow-gauge railroad originally built by Germany before the World War, and now used for the transporting of freight from Beirut to Damascus, we were greeted by a now familiar sight. porters in white linen robes which looked not unlike the old-fashioned nightgown tied around the middle with a soiled red sash, and wearing Mohammedan tarbushes shuffled up and sought our baggage. We paid little attention to the interior of the hotel, that is the main foyer, until our return from our rooms above, where we had immediately retired to remove some of the grime of travel. Intensely hungry, we sought the dining hall. We were ushered into a spacious interior court. Courts are exceptionally common in these eastern countries because they are cool, inviting, and traditional. The walls were all white, against which pots of flowers and climbing vines appeared refreshingly cool. The ceiling was constructed of hand-hewn timbers. Between the tops of the walls and the ceiling was a stone grille-work which allowed ample ventilation. At either end was a high, narrow window, hardly large enough to permit the passage of a man. They were well shaded and kept out the midday heat and glare. Most surprising was the great number of persons that were crowded in this fairly large dining hall. There must have been at least 400 persons seated at long tables, somewhat like those one would find in an army or a construction camp. Instead of being seated on chairs, they were seated on benches which were a part of the table. Most of the diners wore Western clothing, a sack or business suit, and all wore their tarbushes. It is not a custom to remove the tarbush when indoors or when dining. The amusing incident was that all were eating as rapidly as they could, and not a sound of a voice was to be heard. No one was conversing, all intently concentrating upon the consumption of food. It seemed as though they were given a limited time to eat, and could not afford to indulge in conversation. It was so different from the leisurely dining of Europe, where eating is an art and a social event as well. We later learned that it is not a custom among the Syrians and the peoples of the Levant to converse when eating, but rather to devote their attention to food first, and then converse at length afterward. I was also surprised to find a hotel so crowded in such an out-of-the-way place as Damascus. Many of the big hostelries of America and the Western world would have been grateful for such patronage as this hotel was apparently enjoying at this time. If we had seen a similar sight in America, we would have thought a convention was in session. Conventions seemed to be such a Western mode that we did not entertain the thought in this instance. Upon inquiry, we found that this was a momentous occasion in Syria, and that an election was to be held for the president of Syria. The hotel was more than a mere hostelry. It was used as an administration building by government officials and political parties, and in fact all of the principal affairs of state were conducted there. As soon as lunch was finished, the guests all crowded into the hallways, lounge and foyer to congregate in groups, gesticulating wildly with their hands, which is customary among a very highly emotional people such as they are. Suddenly, while we were studying these people who, although mainly dressed as we were, yet were so different in manner, a hush came over the entire assembly. Everyone stood rigid as though for an inspection and immediately ceased talking. We looked about to see the cause of the sudden suspension of activities and conversation. All eyes were fastened upon a large French doorway that led into the dining hall from whence we had just come. The doors were thrust open and a dramatic entry was made in ceremonial fashion by a person whose very appearance indicated a regal position and birth. He was an Arab prince, we learned. He had traveled several hundred miles from a desert area over which he had dominance to participate in these conferences and the election. He was in fact a royal nomad, a desert chieftain. He had control and direction over some 15,000 Bedouins. His costume was impressive and picturesque. He wore a heavy silken robe, full at the bottom, and the conventional Bedouin sandals inlaid with sterling silver. His turban was of a brilliant hue and affixed to his head with the argila. Around his girth he wore a twisted silk cord from which hung on his left side a beautiful dirk, which, although highly ornamental, undoubtedly was quite practical. His wearing of large sunglasses was unusual. Typical of the Bedouin, his hands were quite large and gnarled. His face was long, slender, and with a large aquiline nose characteristic of the Semitic race. He spoke with a soft, vibrant voice and was very graceful in his walk. He had a definite positiveness and self-assurance and reflected the attitude of one accustomed to respect and obedience to his least command or wish. He had descended from a long line of nobility. In the open desert, his word was absolute law. He was the highest court of appeal and made decisions which would shape the course of the lives of those who depended on him. In this election which was now taking place, he could have easily influenced the thousands who were his followers and subjects to vote as he wished for either candidate. Looking neither to the right nor left, he strode out of the hotel toward a waiting carriage, followed by his personal bodyguards, two huge members of his race dressed like himself but not having such ornamentation because of their lesser station. In addition to carrying dirks, the bodyguards also wore, crisscrossed over their chests, cartridge belts having large caliber shells, and slung across each of their backs was a modern rifle. Becoming more curious about the situation, we determined to learn further facts. Later that evening, we made the acquaintance of the British Vice Consul of Damascus, who frequented our hotel because it was the center of local social life, and because the few foreigners or Europeans who visited Damascus for a brief stay, whether on business or pleasure, located there. Thank you for watching, and please don't forget to share, like, subscribe and comment. And if you can please consider donating to Wars of the Roses, links to PayPal and Patreon are in the description. Thank you so very much.